everyone, my name is Francesca. My presentation is called Who Does Misogyny Hurt? And I'm going to be giving a methodological critique of Kate Manne's Down Girl. So rather than analyzing individual misogynists, Kate Manne's Down Girl focuses on how women are targeted by misogyny. However, her account has a critical methodological deficiency because it fails to stipulate who ought to count as a woman. At best, it leaves unresolved who should count as a woman, and at worst, it relies on patriarchal gender binary to determine who is a woman and thus who is hurt by misogyny. As a result, her theory is unable to identify as misogynist the hostility faced by those whose status as women is politically contested. Although her account nominally includes trans women as women, it fails to conceptually justify how examples of gendered hostility against them count as cases of misogyny rather than random occurrences or the operation of gender-neutral social norms. To be clear, I am not taking issue with her lacking analysis of trans misogyny, but rather showing that her analysis conceptually excludes trans women from the start. A possible solution would require an ameliorative and politically informed concept of women to bolster her account of misogyny. And I see that as where social ontology comes in. So under Kate Manne's account, misogyny punishes women for their bad behavior as determined by gendered social norms. Misogyny is constituted by the hostile social forces that target women because they are women in such a way that serves to police and enforce a patriarchal order. Patriarchy consists largely in this uneven gendered economy of giving and taking moral cum social goods and services. The quality of this hostility can be abbreviated as down girl moves, which are an open-ended list of methods used to put women in their place. These include infantilizing, belittling, humiliating, slurring, sexualizing, desexualizing, silencing, as well as violent or threatening behavior. Misogyny thus names the unique kind of social political enforcement mechanism that threatens women into behaving like good women should, according to gendered social norms under patriarchy. Now, according to its subtitle, Down Girl is about the logic of misogyny. But the structure of Manne's account could plausibly describe the hostile social forces that target many different stigmatized social groups, or even an account of how oppressed groups in general are punished for behaving badly, according to hostile, identity-based social norms. If the logic of her account were unique to misogyny, then it would be incoherent if its terms were switched with concepts belonging to a different sort of oppression, such as anti-Black racism in the United States. Yet, one could replace the concepts of patriarchy, misogyny, gendered social norms, and women with white supremacy, anti-Black prejudice, racialized social norms, and Black people, respectively, and end up with a cogent account of systemic racism. In fact, her metaphor of policing and punishing is eerily literal in the context of police brutality and the American prison industrial complex. I grant that racism is not a direct analog to misogyny here, but insofar as there's a functional equivalent to misogyny that punishes people under white supremacy because they're Black and according to racialized social norms, my point still stands. The specific enforcement logic of the hostile social forces that Manne theorizes is not uniquely faced by women. To use an interpersonal illustration, down girl moves, slurring, sexualizing, belittling, can and do happen to Black men that put them in their place when they are perceived as challenging social norms. Thus, the structural logic of her account alone does not constitute misogyny. I should note that on the face of it, having a general logic of oppression is not a strike against her account. It could even help articulate compelling accounts of other forms of social oppression. But in order to qualify as misogyny, rather than a more general account of how certain socially oppressed groups are policed and punished, the specifically misogynist flavor of her account must arise from elsewhere. Yet, social norms are considered gendered based on the fact that women are policed by them. So basically, for man, patriarchy and gendered social norms are what give her account its particularly misogynist flavor. However, these social norms are considered gendered based on the fact that women are policed by them. Patriarchy similarly depends on her account of what women are. Manne claims that patriarchal social norms can be identified positively as the presence of distinctly gendered contents or enforcement mechanisms, and negatively as the absence of hostility that a similarly situated man would face from those norms. A patriarchal social norm is such that a woman gives feminine coded goods to him and refrains from taking masculine coded goods away from him. Women are expected to give these goods to men and not demand masculine coded privileges reserved for men. But despite the presence of distinctly gendered contents and enforcement mechanisms in social norms, it's their differential impact on women as opposed to men that demonstrates that a certain woman is subject to misogyny. In other words, we know that the way we know what belongs on our list of feminine coded goods and services and the examples they pick out as cases of misogyny, because it is women who are targeted as opposed to their male counterparts. The hostile, gendered social forces that constitute misogyny are not present if men would plausibly face the same kind of hostility as women under the same conditions. Notably, in substituting a man for a woman to test out the claim of misogyny, one must hold fixed their social position, their race, class, sexuality, cis or trans status, disability, age, and so on, according to Manne. It is here that Manne nominally includes trans women as potential targets of misogyny on her list of social positions. But to summarize, the way we know that certain hostile social norms are gendered is insofar as they target women and not men, and that is the gendered quality that authorizes them as potentially misogynist. However, Manne does not provide a conceptual account of women besides her analysis of their definition under patriarchy. Rather, she analyzes the interrelation of sexism and misogyny. Sexism differentiates between men and women on illegitimate pseudoscientific grounds and works together with misogyny, which differentiates between good and bad women according to the feminine coded goods that they give to men. But sexist ideology based in a pseudoscientific sex binary is the same rationale that refuses to recognize trans women as women. Instead, trans women would be considered men in virtue of sexism's pseudoscientific biological sex distinction. Consequently, Manne's discussion of sexism cannot justify why those who don't count as women under sexism should count as women under her account of misogyny. What Manne is seeking to do in Down Girl is provide an ameliorative account of misogyny. And by that, she means the feminist appropriation of misogyny in order to point out the gender-based hostility that women face for political liberation. But we can't use sexism's account of men and women to account for every woman who is hurt under this account, because trans women wouldn't count as women to begin with, whether as women as defined by misogyny or sexism. Further, Manne makes the explicit methodological decision to presume the truth of the gender binary in her analysis of misogyny. According to Manne, the gender binary stipulates that people are divided into two mutually exclusive and exhaustive categories of men and women. And as Manne herself admits, misogyny includes a commitment to gender binarism, as well as an anti-trans metaphysics of gender. Thus, trans women cannot be considered women who are therefore hurt by misogyny. Only cis women count. And yet, Manne proceeds as if such falsehoods, the gender binary, are true in order to see what follows. That could be a productive methodological decision, but it has the consequence that Manne fails to conceptualize who ought to count as a woman on feminist terms, independently of their status as defined by patriarchy. The problematic thing is that she's positing that conceptualizing women according to the gender binary can help us come up with a good theory of misogyny. But as a result, it comes up with a theory of misogyny that fails to identify misogyny faced by trans women as misogyny. Regardless, it may seem that one could still successfully pick out and explain instances of misogyny according to Manne's account. One would do this by identifying women as they are defined, either by sexism or by the gendered harm they face. For example, a waitress at a restaurant is working a double shift on a busy weekend. She's worn out, her face hurts from smiling, and her feet throb from running around at the beck and call of customers, managers, and kitchen staff. Finally, she stops smiling, she decides to walk slower, trying to conserve her energy to make it through the day. She's still polite, she fulfills all her customers' requests. But one of her tables, a man and a woman, leave her no tip and a note scrawled on the receipt saying, "Next time, we'd appreciate being served by someone who actually wants to be here." This has plenty of misogynist characteristics under Manne's account. The patronizing note and the lack of a tip is a down girl move that punishes the waitress for failing to give certain feminine-coded services, such as her full attention, her smile, and her eagerness to please. Most importantly, for Manne's account, say that the male coworker of a comparable social position who hates his job and never smiles has never been punished in this way for not smiling. If he did receive a rude note and no tip, we might have reason to doubt that this is misogyny. Instead, we might call it a case of passive-aggressive customers or a punishment according to a gender-neutral social norm about the high standards of friendliness that Americans hold their servers to. But again, according to Manne's criteria, the waitress could reasonably interpret this experience as hostile in the relevantly misogynist way. What matters is the distinctly gendered quality of the hostility, both the presence of gendered contents and the absence of hostility towards her male coworker, in conjunction with the gender of the target, the waitress, the fact that she is a woman. This is a case of a woman, the waitress, being punished for not providing the feminine-coded goods that these customers expect from her due to her gender. However, on what grounds can we say that the waitress counts as a woman and thus as the target of misogyny under Manne's account? This is clearly a problem when we talk about cases of misogyny that involve those whose status as women is denied by sexism, by misogyny, by presuming the gender binary. If I specified that the waitress in the example were a trans woman, then it becomes clear that it cannot count as a case of misogyny, insofar as women are defined only by the gender binary under this account of misogyny. This is despite the fact that the waitress is similarly held to a feminine-coded standard as a giver due to her gender as a woman, whether cis or trans. Again, if the waitress's male coworker had the same experience for not smiling enough, then we would have reason to believe that this is not a case of misogyny. And under sexist ideology, as Manne herself says, trans women are considered men and not women. Thus, the rude note and the lack of the tip would no longer count as gendered, because the target of such hostility is a man in the eyes of misogyny, rather than a woman. Again, one might think that the nominal inclusion of trans women is sufficient to use Manne's account to analyze cases of misogyny against trans women. But in order to identify misogyny for all women, one must stipulate who should count as a woman beyond the gender binary. One might say that Manne's account leaves open who women are, so we can fill it in based on who we already know or think counts as a woman. But in that case, women could still be defined according to political motives that intersectional feminists would disavow, such as trans-exclusionary radical feminists or social conservatives. Then we again fail to analyze the misogyny that trans women face as women. Misogyny shouldn't be the harm that happens to women as defined by sexism, but to women understood on intersectional feminist terms. Just as using the definition of misogyny in popular culture upholds patriarchal interests, so too does employing the gender binary to determine who counts as women. In order to eliminate misogyny for all women, we must provide an ameliorative, conceptual account of women informed by both our political liberatory goals and by our current intersectional feminist use of the term woman. Doing so would link Manne's account with the specific examples and forms of gender violence that she analyzes. This would make her account of misogyny distinct from other kinds of oppression, irreducible to a general account of social oppression, and inclusive to trans women. I'm not quite sure how you would revise Manne's account in such a way. I'm not quite sure what the details would be. Also, it's really hard to come up with a definition of how we should think about women, obviously. This is also where social ontology becomes really helpful. So I'm really curious what you guys think. Some other remaining questions I have, again, to what extent can Manne's theory be modified? If we come up with an account of how we should think about women, are there other issues that arise? Are there other ways that her account excludes certain women or certain types of women from analysis? Furthermore, what's the purpose of analyzing misogyny as primarily the way that women are punished under patriarchy? I see this as providing a lot of valuable insights, especially the way that women are policed in a way that reproduces social norms. But it might also be the case that it shifts the focus away from an analysis of misogyny as it affects people who aren't women, like men, and also people who don't strictly identify as on the gender binary at all. How do we come up with an account of misogyny that still focuses on the way that women are hurt, but also includes the way that people who don't conform to a gender at all are hurt, or the way that people who don't pass or who are misperceived are hurt? And I think that's it for now, but I would love to hear your questions or any glaring holes in my argument. And thank you so much for listening. I look forward to the actual conference. Thank you so much.